I want to start with a kind of an exercise in envisioning, and I want you to imagine yourselves asking a bunch of random people, such as, this bunch of random people. I don't do it now because I'll just get drowned out, but ask a bunch of people what their ambitions are. And you'll get a bunch of different answers, humanity being a fairly diverse crew, but one answer which will appear over and over again is travel. And it's clearly, I think, at this point, a nigh universal human aspiration. I think it's been obviously hardwired into us, from the first hesitant stirrings in the primordial soup to right here and right now. I think that this desire to travel is why the first known Homo sapien sort of loped out of what is now eastern Ethiopia and set out to conquer the world, to the point, in fact, in which this very building and this very facility, the Wheeler Centre, is kind of a monument to the clearly irresistible and I think quite commendable urge of mankind to meander and to explore and to see stuff he hasn't quite previously seen. Now, I'd also like you to imagine asking a bunch of people, possibly the same bunch or a different bunch if you didn't get on too well with the first one, what their most precious memories are. And I'd be willing to bet you quite a lot of money, certainly far more than the average travel writer makes in a given year, which isn't much, that many of those memories would involve travel. And I think that's also to be expected, in that travel is it's a heightened state of excitement. It's a continuous test of what we're used to and what we think we know. Every one of us lives through thousands of days of school and of work and general domestic stuff, which we remember nothing about a month later. But you always remember the first time you went somewhere, even if it was Zurich. So you would think that almost by definition, travel writing, which is to say writing about travel, would be the most exciting writing available anywhere. You would think that indeed the genre would be almost impossible to consume when you consider the logistical difficulties inherent in holding onto your hat while perching on the edge of your seat. And you would think that it would be the most hotly contested field of journalism. You would think that agog readers would be thrilling, hearts aflutter to the most gleaming prose that could be churned out by the most learned, stylish, amusing and swashbuckling writers, such as myself. And you would think that huge surges of domestic violence would occur on weekend mornings as families all over the world beat each other half to death in a struggle to be the first to get their hands on the travel section. Now, as the perceptive will have gleaned from the title of today's oration, Travel Writing and Why It Sucks, it is this speaker's contention that this is far from the case. Most, I think in fact almost all, modern travel writing is atrocious. It's staid, it's timorous, it's trivial, and it's fatuous. And I'm talking here mostly about the travel writing in newspapers and magazines, although a goodly proportion of the ensuing Jeremiad applies just as much to book-length travel narrative, with the obvious exceptions of my own. But it's my belief that this situation is genuinely tragic and altogether avoidable, and perhaps more importantly, actually fixable. But first, I think, to the important task of identifying the problem and then the fun work of apportioning the blame. At the most fundamental level, I think, the problem with travel writing is that it has simply given up reflecting anything of the reality of travel, which is to say that while travel is, at least when you're doing it properly, interesting and unpredictable, travel writing tends towards the dull and altogether unsurprising. Now, by way of illustrating my point, and also of padding out my word count without having to do any work, I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts of a piece of actual travel writing. Now, I'm not going to name the author, because for reasons which I will come to, I don't necessarily hold travel writers altogether responsible for the current state of travel writing. But this feature appeared recently in an American newspaper, which is generally held in very high regard, not least by itself. And my eye was drawn to it because it happened to be about the area of London in which I happen to live. Now, I will concede that picking on this particular piece of travel writing is a little bit unfair on a couple of levels. And another reason I'm not going to name the writer is that I'm sure that he, like me and like every other travel writer I know, is absolutely haunted by the terror that a native of wherever they've just written about will pick their work up and think, what is this clown talking about? But a travel writer doesn't write for the people who already live in a place. They write for the people who might go there or should think about going there or who'll never go there but are nevertheless, quite curious to know what it's like. And I also sympathise to the extent that London is actually a tough subject for a travel writer. So tough, for example, that I've barely ever written a paragraph about it myself, and I've lived there for 20 years. So a lot of people who read anything you write about London are going to have lived in London or been to London or know something about London. And so it's not like knocking together a dispatch from some obscure island or hidden kingdom or a half-destroyed war zone, which, all of which you can usually say what you like about in the knowledge that you're not going to get caught. But even after I've conceded all that, I still feel justified in citing this article as an exemplar of pretty much everything that is wrong with modern travel writing, because everything that is complacent and dreary about this complacent and dreary piece is exactly what's complacent and dreary about whichever travel section is presently lining, unread, your hamster's cage. So we'll start with the headline on this story, and I promise you I'm not making any of this up. Even the headline seems almost as if calculated to send the reader to sleep on the spot. It describes my neighbourhood in the East End of London as, I really kid you not, an oasis off London's beaten path. So in just 6 words, 6 tiny little words, they have got 2 of the most egregious cliches in the travel writing lexicon, the oasis and the beaten path. If they could have found a way to have crowbarred in a land of contrast, they'd have collected on the trifecta. It's actually almost impressive. Now, I'm not saying my neighbourhood is not an interesting and entertaining place to visit, and it is. I mean, especially if you've got a really heightened tolerance for young people with stupid haircuts who seem just that little bit too pleased with themselves. And I'm certainly not saying my neighbourhood is not worthy of examination by a travel writer. It is, and while I'm up that way, I would recommend all of you Ian Sinclair's Hackney That Rose-Red Empire, which is one of the best travel books you'll read. But I am saying that if I read this particular piece without being told in advance where it was set, or without recognising the picture running alongside the copy, I would never have guessed that it's about the part of the world that I know best. And this is because that this article, like far too much of the blancmange that befouls our travel sections, it could have been written by almost anybody about almost anywhere. So, shorn of a couple of choice geographical giveaways, these are actual excerpts from the article. This sentence actually appears. Though the main arteries are often choked by traffic, the side streets can be as tranquil and pleasant as parks. Now, you could say that about Baghdad. It goes on. The area feels totally self-sufficient, thanks to a host of enticing restaurants, shops, markets, and hotels. So does Dubbo. The canal snakes past shimmering new condos, abandoned warehouses, floating vegetable gardens and narrow barges turned into bohemian residences with potted plants in the windows. So that's a bit like absolutely every urban waterway in explored space. And with a little bit of local detail, he says, there was some colourful trash talking during a match at a concrete ping-pong table. At which I have to say there was also at this point some pretty colourful trash talking at the desk where I was reading this. Now, I don't believe that the writer wanted to write this inane pablum any more than any sane human being wants to read it, because I know what travel writers and journalists in general are like, or at least the good ones. We are as a breed sort of curious, restless, somewhat unusual and altogether unemployable characters, which is why we're journalists. And we like telling stories, which is also why we're journalists. We don't actually want to bore people. Having said that, I'm now about to do the most predictable thing any journalist ever does and blame his editors. But before I do that, I feel I should also offer them a measure of sympathy, because all publications are mindful to a greater or lesser extent of the sensitivities of their advertisers. It would be naive to expect them to be otherwise. But travel sections more so than others, and this is because, as I suspect many of you probably know, almost all their journalism is actually paid for by the entities they're writing about. You already see the problem here. The travel writers' flights and hotels and quite a lot of food and generally quite a lot more drink, underwritten by the tour operators and the travel companies, hoping that the readers who read the piece will then be inspired to pay actual money to recreate the piece they've just paid the journalist to take. So the publication only ends up paying for the words the journalist actually writes, and they usually pay for these quite badly. And I think that's... It does sound really terrible when you start complaining that the travel writer pays really badly. I'm not actually looking for sympathy on this score. I'm just observing that, you pay peanuts, you know what happens next. But the consequences of this combination of poor money and, frankly, outright payola are exactly what you would expect, which is what you get in the papers. It's it's not really corruption as such. It's more sort of a sullen, resigned apathy. Any writer knows that their finished work, what appears in the magazine, is sort of it's a negotiated version of what they actually wanted to write, trimmed to the minimum extent they think is necessary to get it past the editor. And that's fine. That's how it's supposed to work. That editorial oversight is still, in the modern context, what separates actual journalism from the unregulated wittering of the blogosphere. I've no problem with that at all. But when a journalist knows that his editor's primary imperative is not upsetting the advertisers, that he knows there's no point then in making fun or making judgments even. He knows that he might as well not bother diligently reporting that there were mice in the hotel, that even the mice would have turned down the food in the restaurants, and that the destination as a whole was sort of populated by heart-rendingly haggard mice, because it's not going to go in the paper. It just isn't. So after a while, the journalist doesn't even bother typing anything negative or opinionated or even interesting for fear of just irritating the editor who pays him what little it is that he makes. And so the truth, it's not just that the truth doesn't get printed, it doesn't even get the opportunity to be deleted. And that's why the travel sections end up filled full of stuff which reads like advertising copy, because it pretty much by that point is advertising copy. Now, I think it's upsetting, and I think it's sad, and I think it's a huge missed opportunity, because a subject as, subjective as travel is surely, you would think, one in which editors can lengthen the leash a little bit. But instead, it tends to be the section of the newspaper in which it actually gets pulled the hardest. Now, this malaise is manifest not only in the stuff that gets cut or the stuff that the writer knows there's no point in even submitting, but also in the stories that just don't get commissioned in the first place. Now, my own favourite places to travel in and write about tend to be those which are slightly, to coin a phrase, off the beaten path. Some of them, in fact, are indeed lands of contrasts. But they're places where, the atmosphere is still a bit febrile and things are at stake and no one's quite sure what's going to happen next. But where there's at least a story to be told. Now, when I suggest places like these to travel editors, they tend to react with a combination of, I don't know how to put it, bemusement and despair, if there's a word that sort of fills in the gap between those. And they sort of tend to mutter that these places, they don't advertise. To which I can only reply that they might feel like there's no point. So somebody at some point, at some publication, does need to take a leap of faith, I think, because the world is full of really interesting places which aren't getting written about and then consequently don't get visited by anybody. And on that subject, I feel I should note that travel writers and indeed even editors are not exclusively to blame. I think some responsibility here has to be shouldered by actual travellers, whose tastes are, of course, what editors are seeking to either reflect or tantalise. It's one of those weird ironies that you note when I see that the travelling public a lot, because I travel a lot. And I know when people travel, they like to think of themselves as being off on a great adventure, because that's the point. But the reality is that travelling is usually when people are actually at their most risk averse. They go to the places everybody's already been, and when they get there, they do the things that everybody's already done. And that just gets more and more ridiculous now that so much of the world is accessible and open and really quite safe to travel in. And I think I mentioned this in the excerpt from my book, which was put up on the website, but I want to mention it again now because it's an image that haunts me, which just strikes me as the defining image of the absurdity of modern mass tourism is if you go to the Louvre in Paris, which is obviously worth doing, but for a start there's always a crowd underneath the Mona Lisa, which again I find weird. What do they think it's going to do? But there's always a crowd, but they're taking photos of it. And I'm mesmerized by the thought of what happens, like how that conversation goes when they go back home and they're showing people the photos. That's the Mona Lisa. And the person's going, God, is that what it looks like? The world's a big place. Go and see it. So it could be argued, I guess, that most travel writing is dreadful in the same way that most writing is dreadful, and indeed that most music is unlistenable and most television is unwatchable and most art is only good for starting fires. You'd be right, of course, because one of the reasons we know the great stuff when we see it is that we spend so much of our lives overwhelmed by mediocrity or outright incompetence. But as I sort of get towards the end here, I would like to offer a glimmer of hope, which I saw in another travel piece I read recently, which was everything most travel writing isn't, and exactly what much more travel writing should be. Now, in this case, I'm happy to name the publication. It's called The Quietus, and probably tellingly, it's a website primarily concerned with music, rather than a newspaper primarily concerned with not upsetting anybody. And I'm also happy to name the writer, whose name is Taylor Parks, and in the interests of full disclosure, I will confess that he and I were briefly colleagues many years ago on a now defunct British rock and roll newspaper called Melody Maker. I would obviously prefer to think that its now defunctness is nothing to do with the fact that we both worked there. But the travel feature in question was published a few weeks ago, and you really should look it up. It's a story about Hamburg, and it was written on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the arrival in the German port of 5 ambitious Liverpudlian teenagers, 3 of whom were Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and George Harrison. Now, Taylor writes absolutely exquisitely about Hamburg as it is now, and also Hamburg as the fledgling Beatles might have seen it. He explains his reasons for being there, and gives the reader reason to follow him, both in print and in person. He knows his history well enough to actually be able to bring the past to life, and he's a smart enough observer to balance it deftly against the present. And I'll hand it to Taylor for a paragraph. The next, I don't know, 70 words or so are him, not me. You're about to notice a massive spike in the quality of the prose. Here's what used to be the Top 10 Club, where the Beatles played 98 consecutive nights, where Paul and Stuart Sutcliffe had their onstage punch-up in front of a monstrous crowd. The Top 10 lasted until 1988, at which point it became the Moondoo, a more conventional night spot aimed at more obviously conventional people. Beatles walking tours stop here. Guides stand outside the locked Moondoo door and hold up photos of the Beatles performing a few feet away in space and a million miles away in time. John Lennon out of his mind in filthy bleached jeans, pulling awful spastic faces ringed with smoke and drained brown bottles. Even in these happy snaps, you can feel the brutality and joy and desperation. What the hell happened here? Now, I'd submit, this is me again, by the way, I'd submit that any sentient person interested in Hamburg or the Beatles or travel or music or indeed pretty much anything would want to read on to find out. But I know for a fact that not a single newspaper travel section anywhere in the world would print a word of this, never mind all 5,500 words that the Quietus did. Now, this is a shame at a kind of basic, intimate, micro level, because it means not enough people are getting to read sentences describing the works of the early Beatles, and again, over to Taylor, as songs that pound their 12-bar enclosures in frantic circles like zoo animals demanding more space, more time. And it represents a shame, me again, sorry, at the macro level, as it's the very rarity, I think, of a story like this, which indicates that there is a vast and fascinating and wonderful and maddening world of stories simply languishing untold. Travel writing in its present atrociously withered state is making what should be the most fun job in the world seem like absolutely no fun at all, and it is failing abjectly at what I think could be a higher purpose of furthering curiosity and understanding in a world still, as you'll know if you've seen the news recently, somewhat prone to hostility and suspicion. Now, almost nowhere that I know of now is travel writing doing what it should, which is challenging readers to think and to learn and to laugh, and most importantly of all, to travel. All too often and far too much, the only challenge travel writing is posing to anybody right now is the challenge of staying awake until the sponsored fact box at the bottom of the page. Thank you.